Welcome everybody to our live Google Hangout with Dr. Sean Deoni. And this is Catherine Roman from Natural Mom Hub and Denver Natural Mom. And this is a pretty groundbreaking hangout for us. You know, we talk a lot about evidence in how we raise our babies, but this is my first opportunity to talk to somebody who's actually creating that evidence for us to draw conclusions from. So welcome, Sean, and would you do us the pleasure, just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Sean Deoni. So I'm actually a neuroimaging physicist by training. So I did my PhD in physics, and slowly over time I've been working my way towards neurodevelopment. So I originally from, as you can tell from my accent, not from the US. I'm originally from Canada, just outside of Toronto. Did my PhD in physics and neuroimaging at the University of Western Ontario, and then took that to the UK for a postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychiatry and neuroimaging at both the Institute of Psychiatry and then Oxford University. And then I've made my way back to North America, first to Brown University, where we started the Advanced Baby Imaging Lab at Brown, and now to Children's Hospital of Colorado and the University of Colorado and the Children's Hospital Imaging and Learning and Development Lab. So that's kind of been the long nomadic pathway that's gotten me to where I am now.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned that now you're being seen as an expert on breastfeeding. Did you ever see your path in physics leading you to this point?
No, not at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that 3 years ago I couldn't say the word breast. So it's been quite a remarkable transformation, as it were.
Well, congratulations on that. So today we're talking about brain development in our babies and what we can do as parents to promote healthy brain development. So I know that we're going to take the whole hour to kind of delve into the different facets of this, but how can you kind of start us off with just, you know, maybe what we're learning now that we didn't know before that's helping us to kind of come to these conclusions?
Yeah, so I think, you know, in general, we're kind of learning probably what we always knew, actually, and that is, you know, the biggest thing is really, I think the take-home message is to love your child. I think if you get that done, you do that well, you're well on your way. But certainly, as life has changed, you know, we're exposed to all sorts of different exposures that we weren't previously, all sorts of different influences, and so we're trying to now sort of sort our way through that. And these can be things like environmental exposures, depending on where you live. That can be things like heavy metals, lead, etc. If you're in Flint, Michigan, for example, right now. Obviously, lead is a big concern, but that's been a big concern across most of the Northeast for quite a while due to old lead paint facilities as well as leaded gasoline. It can even be a problem in more developing settings where heavy metals such as mercury, etc., associated with old electronics are being dumped, and that's getting into the food source. And then working your way all the way through to maternal health. So maternal health throughout pregnancy as well as post-pregnancy, child health, child nutrition, and various genetic conditions and influences that we're just starting to sort of understand and begin to explore. So, you know, as I say, I think the basic emphasis at the start is just love your child, but we're starting to learn what exactly kind of comes out of that and what we can do to sort of modulate various things that also play a role.
Okay, so let's just start with some of these factors. You know, you mentioned love, and so a lot of what I've read is, you know, talking about like regardless of home or anything else, the interaction our children receive is paramount. So can you speak to that a little bit and, you know, exposing what should we be, how should we be engaging that really does help them develop and help their brains develop?
Yeah, so, you know, this is kind of one of these interesting topics that's as small or as big as you want it to be. You know, I think, you know, from the very basic of just being with your child, and unfortunately, a lot of our knowledge around this subject actually comes from the deficits. So a lot of our information on the importance of maternal bonding, of looking at your child, of talking to your child, of holding your child, the sort of skin-to-skin contact, unfortunately comes from studies where kids were denied that. So the biggest study, for example, that's been out there has been following the Romanian orphans from the late 80s, early 90s. So in this case, the Ceausescu regime put all of these infants into large orphanages where they were denied any sort of social interaction, basically put into cages, as it were. And thankfully, due to a large humanitarian effort, a lot of those kids were adopted out into the UK and the US and Canada. But we're now starting to see the effects of that. So a lot of those children have a lot of issues with social emotional processing. They have a lot of issues with anxiety, depression. They have very autistic tendencies. And all those kind of relate to the length of time they spent in those orphanages or were deprived of those environmental stimulation, as it were. So, kind of building on that, there's a large number of studies just simply looking at how, for example, you're talking to a child plays an important role. There's a number of initiatives around this so-called 30 million word gap. So if you take an example of children coming from a high SES home or socioeconomic status home with lots of resources versus child coming from perhaps more poverty, it seems that there's about a 30 million word difference that those kids have been exposed to. And that's directly then linked up to academic and scholastic performance in those children. We can also look at just simply maternal bonding and skin-to-skin contact directly after birth. If we look in, again, we tend to do a lot of these things in extremes. So if you look at children who are born premature, those who are directly put on mom's chest directly after birth, and given that skin-to-skin or kangaroo care throughout that newborn period, seem to do much better in terms of cognitive development, the ability to handle stress, anxiety, etc., far better than the kids who are unfortunately sort of either, in some cases because they had to be, moved off directly to an incubator straight away. So again, sort of maintaining those maternal bonds. And so I think if you look around, you can actually see the effect of that in these new hospitals that are kind of being developed around that concept of that baby being in mom's room as soon as they're born. The idea of putting the child directly onto mom's chest directly after birth, or in the case of C-sections, for example, onto the dad's chest, which is equally as valid. There's a lot of around that.
And Sean, I should add that some of our Denver hospitals are using like a skin-to-skin shirt for moms. So even in the operating room, they're able to achieve that. And that's something that our moms talk a lot about. We hear about this idea of family-centered cesarean and trying to make it include those elements of skin-to-skin regardless of kind of where the baby actually is born. So yeah, it's great to know that even those simple acts from the very beginning can have an impact, a huge impact for later on.
Yeah. For example, just to kind of sort of maybe drive that home, we're just beginning a large multi-center study, mainly through developing settings. So it's funded through the World Health Organization and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look exactly at skin-to-skin contact following premature birth. They believe so strongly in it that there's a large initiative around that to try to implement that throughout most of Africa, India, etc. So there's definitely a lot of legs behind that and a lot of support for that research.
Just to take this conversation kind of one step up to a higher level, because one question that I got from a mom was asking about, what's more important, what I do as the mother while I'm pregnant, or what I do with my infant themselves once they're, here, earthside. So
yeah,
is there an easy answer to that?
No. They're both really important, I think. So the one thing that we need to remember is that there's always a temporal influence. So for example, if you have a folic acid deficiency early on, that can lead to neural tube defects in your child, right? Whereas a folic acid deficiency when the child is 12 leads to mild forms of depressive feelings, right? So very, very vastly different outcomes depending on when that deficit occurs. So, so we need to kind of keep that in mind when we sort of think about these things. But that said, I kind of think of the really interesting thing about human development is that it's very long. We come out at birth really almost a blank slate. Yes, a lot of things have been kind of laid out. General brain structure has been laid out, but most of the larger neuroimaging, or certainly brain development processes, for example, myelination, axonal pruning, which all are kind of underlie brain learning and plasticity, are just beginning at birth. So we've done a lot to set up the situation and kind of set the stage, but there's a lot that happens afterwards. So it's difficult to say, well, where do we put our, if we had to put a bet somewhere, do we put it in the prenatal stage, or we do put it at the the postnatal stage? And we don't quite know where that should be. And it depends on what we're trying to look at. So for example, as I say, if you're looking at nutrition, certainly nutrition is very important early on in pregnancy and throughout pregnancy to kind of, again, set the stage. And that kind of can ward off things, as I say, as neural tube defects, growth restriction in the child, prematurity, etc. But then nutrition postnatally is also equally important. Again, you have all these developmental processes going on. Your brain is trying to go from the size it is to almost adult size, so a 5-fold increase in size in 5 years. Right? And most of that actually occurs over the first 2 years. So tremendous amounts of energy are required to help accomplish that. And all that's coming from nutrition, from interaction. All that's being driven, in essence, by interaction. So again, it's really difficult. But I would say that the nice thing that we're beginning to see, for example, is that, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, there's a lot that can be done to impair development after birth, but also a lot that can be done to improve development after birth. So things, for example, like nutrition are easily modifiable and can have a large impact postnatally. So again, it's difficult to say, well, it's all prenatal, it's all postnatal. Thankfully, a lot of it's postnatal, so we can actually do something about it, which is good.
Well, I think too, I choose to see those as opportunities, right? So our moms who are listening, who are getting ready to get pregnant or who are already expecting, there's opportunity right now. And then if your baby's already here, the opportunity just continues, right? And it seems like, we've got these different components that can impact. So, let's go ahead and dive into nutrition, because I know that's what you said has really emerged to be, would you say, one of the strongest correlations to the brain development piece, or why has it been the big focus of everything that you've studied?
It certainly has popped out. I think one of the reasons that it's been sort of become a focus is because it's probably one of the easiestly modifiable factors that we have to control, right? Very difficult to increase a mom's education level. Right? I mean, it's doable, but that takes time. Very difficult to change a child's environment. We can't just easily move from, say, India to here, right, for example. So, but we can certainly change nutrition anywhere. And so that's why it's kind of become a major influence, I think, that we've started to really sort of zero in and investigate. And it does seem to play a significant role as well. So, both those together kind of make it an important thing that we're looking at.
Sure. Okay, so here's a question about nutrition during pregnancy, and maybe if you could give us kind of high level from your research, what are the things that you mentioned folic acid, but that everybody kind of baseline needs to have? And then I want to ask you really specifically about protein.
Yeah, so I think, in all of these things, we're definitely seeing, and this, again, unfortunately, a lot of this work comes from the instances where there are deficits. So if we look at developing countries where there's malnourishment, you can definitely see the effects of outcome on those kids. So, but things like choline, iron, zinc, calcium, long chain fatty acids. That includes cholesterol, but also DHA, these sorts of things. All of those are essential nutrients that get incorporated into your child's brain, both prenatally and then early postnatally as well. So all of those things are kind of key contributors to development. And then there's other vitamins as well that kind of fall along with that. So again, folic acid or B9, B12, vitamin E even, potassium, etc. So they all kind of play a role. And we ordinarily in a healthy diet, we would get everything that we need. Whether we consider the standard American diet healthy is another question. But as long as we're getting each of those nutrients to help mom, and so mom is not losing weight, mom is gaining weight, and we're not replacing those nutrients with sort of dead calories, as it were, coming from sugar, refined sugars, etc., then we're going to be in good shape. And if you're worried about it, I mean, there's lots of prenatal vitamins out there that you can easily take to bump up, certainly at least the vitamin portion of that. And certainly that's been something that's been seen, across both the U.S. and other developing nations.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this question about going back to protein and specifically animal proteins, because we did get a question whether you think that vegetarian or vegan moms can have babies with healthy brains.
I certainly think so. I mean, it's certainly happening already. If there was a huge issue, we would have found it, and there'd be a massive public health issue around it. So that's certainly not the case. I think, again, as long as you as a mom are gaining weight, your nutritional status is what it should be. So again, you're not deficient in any of these nutrients, then you're going to be all right. We can see, it's one of the surprising things that we've seen is that mom's health in terms of weight and obesity, we've known for a while that plays a role in child health outcomes. So a child born to an obese or overweight mom tends to be at risk for health outcomes such as diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, etc. But we're actually now starting to see that those kids are also at risk for behavioral disorders as well. So higher incidence of ADHD, higher incidences of anxiety, depression. And so, but what's somewhat interesting is that not only is that true in your obese moms, it's also true in your underweight moms. So being underweight is almost as equally impactful as being well overweight. Okay, so again, you kind of want to be in that healthy zone. And as long as your nutrition is there and you're in that, you're generally overall healthy, and it's certainly obviously something for your pediatrician or OBGYN to sort of work with you if you aren't, then that seems to be generally promoted with and associated with optimal brain development.
I wasn't really sure where we were going to go with some of this nutrition stuff, because I think for people that are trying to be healthy, we get so bogged down in X% of my calories every day should come from carbohydrates and this specific group of carbohydrates. And, it can be very, you kind of put pressure on yourself to follow this regimen, right?
Right.
Or a certain diet. But what you're saying is really, we live in a place where everybody can afford prenatal gummies or whatever, and most of us should just make that effort to please take your vitamin every day. And for the most part, that's going to cover at least our mineral needs, our vitamin needs, right, to build a healthy brain for our babies. So I am somewhat relieved that the takeaway can be as simple as just remember to take this. Do you find? Yeah.
I mean, we've been, as I say, moms have been getting pregnant for a long time, and as a species, we've done all right. So, it can't be so difficult, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and then sometimes we're like, well, our produce isn't as nutritious as it was 100 years ago because of the way we farm, and we can get so bogged down in this kind of optimal optimal, going for the most. But like you said, you know, we've been doing this and we're getting good at it. We're still good at it. So there's even more we can be doing. So let's switch gears a little bit to, once our babies are here, what should they be eating? Obviously, we're going to talk about breastfeeding a little bit. So let's talk about breast milk and just what are some of the things that have been found with breast milk breastfeeding in your studies?
Yeah, so I mean, well, the first thing that was found is that this is a hugely emotional issue.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Which, as a physicist, I didn't fully appreciate before
wait a second. There wasn't like training for dealing with moms and mommy wars in your.
No. That was not a required course in physics PhD land. So it was sort of a trial by fire, as it were. But nonetheless, yeah. So I mean, obviously, you know, there's been a large number of studies focused on, you know, breastfeeding versus formula feeding versus what's in breast milk versus the process of breastfeeding, you know, and some of these things we can't necessarily tease apart. So, for example, we can take large pieces of equipment and we can do all sorts of analysis to see exactly what's in breast milk, and we can compare that to what's in formula. What we can't necessarily do is mimic the process of breastfeeding, right? So there is, again, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, this whole maternal-child bonding. There is oxytocin and other bonding chemicals that are associated with breast milk that are given to the child. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that, and amazing, I think, is that breast milk is probably the most dynamic composition or nutrient that we have. So not only does it supply all the various nutrients, not only for brain development, but also for growth, but it's also involved in our immune system, development of our immune system. In fact, it plays the role of our immune system early on, and it's dynamically changing. So mom gets sick, breast milk changes. Child begins to get sick, breast milk changes to help accommodate for that. So it's an amazing, amazing thing. And of course, formula doesn't necessarily have that. It's sort of a singular time point, as it were. That said, everything that we know that we need from breast milk is in formula. So yes, we can point to various studies that have shown improved brain development associated with breastfeeding. And actually, I've always kind of found it interesting that we always show that breastfeeding always seems to be the exception. I don't know if you've noticed this. It's kind of one of these weird things. I mean, we would never say not smoking is associated with better lung function, right? But we'll say that breastfeeding is associated with better brain, as opposed to, you know, formula feeding is associated with reduced brain development. But nonetheless, so we have a number of studies at least showing that early on breastfeeding is associated with improved immune system function, improved neurodevelopment. Whether those gains in neurodevelopment are prolonged is sort of an open question, mainly because we haven't done these sort of rigorous longitudinal studies to answer that question. Typically what's been done in the older kiddos is you take your adolescents or whatnot and you study them and you say, well, how are you doing? You do IQ tests on them, maybe do some MRI images, and then you ask the parents or themselves, well, were you breastfed as a kid? And then you just make these 2 points and you go, oh, see, look, it's better. And that ignores everything that happened from, say, 3 months of age to when you study them at maybe 18 or 24 years of age.
Can I interject really quickly?
Yep.
We also have so many different configurations of breastfeeding. I mean, you mentioned that we can't really separate, like, what is the bonding piece, but what about a mom that, you know, we have moms who are super dedicated and they pump their breast milk and they feed in a bottle. And is that any different from, you know, breast right to baby? So, you know, then people are feeding in combination. And it sounds like when you ask a teenager, were you breastfed? It's a yes or no. And when we have young babies, we're agonizing over, well, we did formula for a week, or I breastfed exclusively for X amount of time. And it doesn't sound like the research is really getting into that nitty gritty of, okay, this baby was breastfed for 12 months and didn't have anything, never had formula, versus a baby who had some breast milk and some formula. Is that true?
Yeah, so I can say that, so, rather than speaking in generalities, I guess I can say that what we've done. So the study that we've looked at, we tried to get into all these points. So the nice thing is that we are following longitudinally moms who are developing and infants who are developing. We are collecting information every 3 to 6 months on their breastfeeding status. So what they were feeding, how much of the, if they're doing breast and formula, what was the percentage between those two? What kind of formula were you using? Was that switching over time? When did you switch into complementary foods? So how long was the exclusivity, etc. And so what we found was that one, there was an increased brain development in children who were exclusively breastfed for at least 3 months of age. And that was pretty much global throughout the brain. Relative to both kids who received partial formula and exclusive formula. Okay? That was true not only in terms of brain development, but also in terms of cognitive outcomes. And we tried to control for as many things as we possibly could. So we tried to control for things like mom's education level, mom's intelligence, and in general family income, right, which we know will definitely impact a child's cognitive development. We matched for family size, for maternal or marital status. So how many moms were divorced versus living with their partner versus married, race, ethnicity, number of children in the family. So bigger families versus smaller families, number of languages spoken. So we tried to match for as many things as we had data on. And despite matching for all of those, these results were still significant. Now, that's not to say that all breastfed kids were above the formula-fed kids or the mixed feeding, right? We're talking about averages here. But in general, on average, the kids who were exclusively breastfed had the most advanced brain maturation and cognitive outcomes up to about 2 years of age. That's as far out as we went. We're now moving that out to 5 years of age, and those results still seem significant. And so that is kind of a bit of a break from what's been shown before. Again, previously, most people have said, is it breastfeeding, not breastfeeding, right? And so mixed has been kind of either lumped into the formula feeding or cast aside in general, whereas we nicely at least had that information. A lot of other studies, for some reason, haven't seemed to go through this sort of rigorous matching process. So you don't know if you're seeing the effect of breastfeeding or the effect of maternal bonding. Now, actually, I should say that we can't dissociate maternal bonding from breastfeeding because those were intrinsically linked. We did have, and it's interesting that you pointed it out, 4 moms who did exclusively bottle feed breast milk. So they were sort of the rigorous and religious pumping moms who went through that process. We included them in the exclusively breastfed group because unfortunately, with only 4, we couldn't break them out and look at those kids by themselves as a separate group. There's just not enough statistical power to look at them. But it's exactly those kids that we'd like to look at because I think that would give us some additional information into, well, is it the maternal bonding and looking at your child, although you tend to do that even when you're formula feeding, or is it the actual constituents of breast milk that are important? Now, for a breastfeeding mom, probably doesn't matter, right? You're getting both. But there's a large number of kiddos who can't be breastfed, either because of mom or they're born very premature, and so they're in an incubator. We can't just cast those kids aside, right?
Especially if those are the kids that we could help the most by really understanding the benefit to them.
Exactly. And so, that's where those sort of information come into play. What additional components do we need or that are lacking or needed in better combinations or contributions to sort of maximize those outcomes in those kiddos who can't be or just aren't breastfed. And so that's what we're working towards understanding now. And again, most of that needs to be done in animal models. Obviously, is very unethical to suddenly start giving children different formulas with different nutrients taken out to see which one is important. But we might be able to do that in various animal models and whatnot. So we're working towards that now.
Sean, you mentioned that you're extending the kind of the observation period from 2 to 5. Is there a point where the difference may not be discernible between a baby that's been breastfed or formula fed?
Absolutely. I think, we're just getting now to the point where those kids are entering school. And so now all sorts of other factors begin to come into play. So there's a large, different environment, social, emotional factors begin to play, just the general learning environment begin to play. And so it's now possible that those differences either begin to become normalized, so they begin to attenuate. But at the same time, we do know that factors related to socioeconomic status, so again, going back to moms and the family's income and the opportunities that can afford, are increasing at that time period as well. So, that tends to be almost negligible at birth and begins to increase as children get older. Begin to become majorly important around 2 to 3 years of age, and then more so after that. And so I think, it's probably at that point where you might begin to see an inflection that, yes, you've set them off, you've given them this initial boost, and now other factors are going to begin to start to either mess that up or amplify them. So, and so how that actually begins to play out is another question.
Yeah. So in other words, formula fed babies in well-educated homes, speaking multiple languages and spending tons of time reading and playing and talking to baby, those kids are probably not going to be any different, especially come kindergarten, from a baby that was exclusively breastfed, for any length of time, really.
Yeah. I think that's actually the case. But at the same time, one of the most striking findings, and this is it's not published and it's probably hasn't gone through peer review, so take it with a grain of salt. But when we looked at children from high SES versus low SES, so that was derived basically from parents who had college education and above, so college, master's, PhD, medical degree, law degree, etc., versus parents who had just reached high school and college, so hadn't graduated from college. We look at the development of those kids. They do become more and more different with age. But if you look at just the breastfeeding groups between those two, they're exactly the same.
Say that again. So within the same SES group, the breastfeeding outcomes were the same.
So if you took the high SES and the low SES kids that were breastfed, there's no difference between them.
Okay.
But on average, if you look at high SES and low SES, there's about 2 standard deviations in IQ difference between those kids at 5 years of age. So that's the difference of being over. And so, we think of IQ being an average of 100 with a standard deviation of 15. So, and normal kids who go to university tend to have an IQ of about 114. Okay. The difference between those kids was 115 versus 85.
So, but breastfeeding helped to equalize. Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So again, now the question is it the breastfeeding that's doing that? Is it nutrition, right? Is it the early nutrition that's sort of setting things up and allowing, as a protectant? Or is there something very special about those families? That other things are contributing to sort of normalize those things, and breastfeeding is just one of those contributors. That's probably very likely the case. I don't think we can just suddenly say it's all breastfeeding, but certainly there's an obvious effect there, and we're trying to tease apart and try to understand exactly what it is.
So are you aware of any research that looks at the brains of second-born or third-born children? And the reason I ask this is because we're expecting our second now, and I think about my state the first time around versus this time, and is my body, or does my body get less able to kind of build healthy brains?
Yeah, this is kind of another one of these interesting things where there seems to be there's certainly been work in human children and work in family or in animal studies. Obviously animal studies you can do a lot quicker because you can breed mice every few months or so. But it's certainly what we've seen is that, and I think any parent who's had 2 or more kids, and I certainly hope this is true because I'm the 4th of 4. So, but anyone who's had more than 1 or 2 kids will know that the younger children tend to develop more rapidly. And this is actually quite true. So if you look at the second-born child, third-born child, fourth-born child, and you look in areas associated with social development, language development, they're developing more quickly than the first-born child was. Possibly due to increased environmental stimulation because they have a play date kind of kicking around all the time. Interestingly, motor wasn't one of those areas that was more rapidly developing, even though they probably have to get out of the way more often. But yeah, so it was mainly social emotional development seems to be improved in those kids. Now there have been studies that have suggested maybe that IQ decreases with number of child. If that's true, then I should go to my older brothers and sisters and say, "What's your problem?" But what's your excuse? But I certainly think that we've not seen that. All those kids are doing exactly the same as they were, and in certain areas developing more robustly and rapidly.
Sure. Well, thank you once again for reassuring me in my own mothering journey through our interview. But I do want to ask you a little bit about, what we feed our kids once they are eating, have access to the same foods that we adults have access to. And I was incredibly strict with my daughter around food and, avoiding gluten and processed and just tons of things, and sugar and refined sugar specifically. And now that she's had a jelly bean, it's all over. So do you guys see anything with sugar consumption and, all of our documentaries that talk about how sugar is just everywhere now in all of our foods, and in formula? So I was just wondering if you could speak to kind of the sugar impact.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually, tricky because there's multiple forms of sugar, right? So again, obviously there's sucrose, which is our usual sort of normal, natural sugar. Fructose, so high fructose corn syrup and such, and then lactose, which is in breast milk, right? So, so there's a lot of different OSs kicking around. We have not necessarily looked directly at sugar intake as a function of brain development, and I try to do a real quick scholar search to see if that was actually true and see if anyone's actually done that, and it turns out they haven't. So it's an open question. But that said, there's been a number of different sort of teasing studies to look at that. So for example, there have been some studies done in older children and adolescents looking at memory function following either a sucrose drink, water, or fructose. And certainly there's almost I wouldn't call it a dose effect, but obviously if those kids are hungry, they do better with sucrose relative to fructose relative to plain water. And if they're not hungry and they're thirsty, water is the best choice.
So as far as what drinks should be served in our school cafeterias?
Depends if the kids are hungry or not. But but I think, yes, straight water seems to be, at least in that case, the best. Now, there have been studies then that look at sort of the infamous one of cereal in children before they go to school. And again, cereal tend to be, allow improved learning, improved working memory, these sorts of things. However, you have to remember that the control for that was no food. So that's not necessarily saying cereal is good. It's just saying that food is good. So, you need to look what the control is. But certainly the biggest thing that we've seen and that I kind of pulled up, and this is true, actually, I look back in our own data, is child obesity. So whatever is causing that, if it's being caused by increased sugar intake, which then causes a child to have to eat other calories to get their national, nutritional value in order to grow. And that leads to obesity in those kids, then that is associated with poor brain development, poor cognitive outcomes, poor learning and scholastic outcomes. So, so the direct link to sugar is a bit tricky, but there does seem to be at least some evidence that at least you want to avoid obesity in the children, and that depending on whether they're hungry or not, it does seem that at least sugar drinks, not necessarily fructose drinks, but sugar drinks can be beneficial. Again, they have to be hungry for that. It can't just be, well, here, take this, and then off you go. A lot of these things, you have to sort of really remember how the studies are set up. And this is always one of these tricky bits. When you start thinking about cognitive enhancers, right? So you could say in that case, oh, well, sugar drink is a cognitive enhancer. Yes, that's true. However, so is nicotine, and so is caffeine, right? If you're not exposed to both of those, you'll have tremendous improvement in working memory and learning after you have, either have a cigarette or a cup of coffee.
Right. We're not giving those to our toddlers. So.
Right. That's not the public health message I want. So
don't worry. I got you.
So again, you have to look back at the studies that have been done, whether it's just a singular time point that you then looked at outcomes, or whether this is longitudinal. And certainly, as I say, in terms of longitudinal, healthy diets associated with normal weight gain, normal weight, is associated with the most optimal brain development. As soon as you start, again, getting into malnourishment, you have cognitive stunting and physical stunting. So the child isn't growing as much as they are, and their cognition suffers. And similarly, obesity, same problem. Just not getting the nutrients that your brain needs to grow as it should. And there are associated cognitive and academic deficits associated with that.
So let me ask about one more supplement that we see, at least in the marketing around food and stuff for our kids, and that's the added DHA. And, omega-3s and eat cold water fish and all that stuff's kind of been going around. But do you guys see positive implication for some of these like fortified foods that have added DHA, or how else can we supplement that for our kids?
Yeah. So again, everything that I'm saying needs to be taken with the singular grain of salt that our kiddos are typically developing. So yes, we do have some premature infants in there, but they're all kids who are have active and family environments, etc. So we're not looking at the extremes. So it makes life teasing these little bits out a little bit more tricky. That said, so we know that one of the reasons that breastfeeding was always promoted and is always promoted, and seems to be the knock on to why it's beneficial for brain development, is because it has these long chain fatty acids in it, be it DHA or AA, etc. And now those have been begun to be introduced into formulas for sure. You can certainly get supplements, and then I think it's even being added into follow-up milks and formulas, etc. The only studies that have actually ever shown that DHA supplementation is beneficial are in premature infants. Otherwise, in terms of randomized clinical control trials where full-term infants who are on formula, for example, are randomized into groups of DHA fortified formulas versus not DHA fortified formulas, no differences in terms of brain development and cognitive outcomes in those kids. So now that's not to say maybe if you're deficient, you should be taking that. But the question is, well, does supplementation help? And there doesn't seem to be evidence for that. Right? So if you're deficient, now that said, there's also never been shown a detriment to taking more, right? So if you're worried, take a supplement. It's not going to, there's no negative effects, it seems, associated with it. So if you're worried, take it. If you're not, you're probably going to be all right.
Good. Well, thanks for clarifying that piece, because I think also, we're always trying to do the best thing for our children. And when we see the packaging, sometimes it just raises a lot of question as to, okay, well, who's saying that I need this or that I don't already have it, or, whatever it is. So sometimes it's nice to kind of distill down.
Yeah. And I'm not actually, I'm not sure if there's been studies that have, there must be. So I'm not going to say that because I think they might sort of muddy the water, but certainly, as I say, the only studies that have actually conclusively shown that it's beneficial have been in really premature infants. And even in that case, the prolonged benefit, past 5-6 years wasn't necessarily shown. So, now as I say, that's in healthy kiddos. So if we were to move into kids who are deficient, who never see fish, who never see omega or long chain fatty acids, would it help? Possibly, but that hasn't been done. And certainly most of our studies were done on the East Coast, where access to fish was not a problem. So,
right. So, well, and that's something else that I had read, that, pregnant women being warned away from all fish is a big mistake. And that, especially during pregnancy, we need to be eating fish every week. And, the mercury thing is kind of a bit of a conspiracy theory. Those are totally my words, but that's been kind of overestimated and made a big fuss about women being really scared about mercury in fish when they may be missing out on some of the positive benefits of eating fish on a regular basis. So,
yeah, I certainly think, we have a newish, I guess, 14-month-old. And certainly, watching my wife go through that, through pregnancy and then our early postnatal periods. Holy goodness. The number of rules and sort of seemingly regulations on what you can eat, when you can eat it, etc., is definitely daunting. And now they seem to be almost being revised a little bit. Certainly, I know exposure to peanut butter, for example, is now being suggested because it does seem to ward off peanut allergies. So a little bit of peanut butter exposure early on, whereas before that was a definite no-no. So a lot of these things are beginning to be revised a little bit.
Well, Sean, any work that you can do to bring us back to being kind of sensible, intuitive mothers, I would really appreciate. That would further my mission.
Well,
I love the evidence and the science is great, but I also think that we need to reinforce to moms to do a lot of times if we listen to our bodies, that will help us figure out what we need.
I think you're absolutely true. I think you're absolutely right. And again, this, I think, kind of hopefully gets embodied back in the first statement of love your child. Love yourself and love your child. You accomplish those two pieces. You're ahead of the game. I think you're going to be interacting with your child. You're going to be taking care of yourself, both nutritionally and through activity. You're going to be taking care of your child. You're going to be going out for walks. All these sorts of things, interacting with your child, playing with your child, feeding them well, all of which kind of set up that infrastructure and lay the foundation for everything they're going to do later on. So it kind of comes back to the, as you say, it's a pretty simple concept, really. Love your
Yeah, I know. And you're trying to take me, I love that as like even our wrap up, but I do have to squeeze in a few more questions and I still have you for 10 more minutes. So we hear a lot about microbiome and good bacteria and gut flora and things like that. And usually that conversation is tied to immune health.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything that you can tell us about the connection between that bacteria and brain development or brain health?
Yeah, this is like the Wild West right now, I think. And I almost sort of liken it, and I'm sure that if there are people who are working on microbiome, they're going to grab their pitchforks and come after me. But I kind of feel like we're almost back where we were with DNA, 15 years ago, where this is going to be the answer to everything. And it might very well be. But I think people are running around everywhere trying to sort this out, and things are a bit scattered and foggy right now. You know, we have some studies that seem to suggest there's a link between specific flora and microbiome profiles and symptoms associated with autism. So there's, I think, a study at the University of Toronto that was looking at that. We just really don't know. And the reason for that is twofold. One, it's a really difficult question to answer because the microflora are changing dramatically, daily, even. And certainly, you know, we actually did this study. Probably shouldn't say this because IRB will find out and come after me. But we were grabbing, you know, oral microbiome samples on my own infant throughout most of his childhood, because I was sort of wondered, you know, what happens when he moves from breastfeeding to complementary food? That's going to disrupt all sorts of things. Or, you know, mom goes on antibiotics for something. That changes the breast milk, changes, that gets into the child, almost obliterates their microbiome for weeks, if not months. You know, what is all that doing, and how's it all changing? And you really need to have very constant measures as to how that's happening and how that's changing. And I sort of think of brain development being more of a long-term integrator of all those changes. So, you know, brains don't change, even in infancy, they're not changing on a near daily basis, you know, in terms of, it's more of a long-term gradual process. So it's difficult to say, oh, well, this microbiome change is associated with this outcome. The science just isn't there yet, I think. We'd like to work on it, but again, it's kind of the Wild West. No one really knows what to look at. It's tricky. So there's a lot to be done. That said, I will say that for our own kid, again, anecdotal, for our own little guy, those microbiome, or sorry, little drops for gas worked phenomenally. So I don't know what the heck they were doing, but at least he was a lot happier. So he slept better, and sleep is definitely associated with brain development. So you put all that together, maybe it's useful, but who knows?
No, that's great. And that's a perfect segue to sleep, because I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about sleep, and also if we can get to it, some discussion of electronics, because you know, we touched on that in our little preview call, and I think it's really important to take away some kind of, I don't know, reassurance for parents that, you know, putting a timer on electronic time, or not having it at all, or whatever, however it's kind of managed in your home, to have some like research at your back. So let's talk about sleep and electronics.
Yeah, I mean, sleep, obviously incredibly important. We don't spend 3/4 to 50% of our day sleeping for nothing, right? It does a lot. A lot's been shown, you know, new research started to come out saying that, you know, maybe its role is to clean out a lot of byproducts of development, kind of set the stage for the next day's learning. It sort of definitely seems to be a time when, at least early on during the day, we build up all these synapses, we build all these connections in our brain, and then throughout the night, throughout sleep, the ones that aren't necessarily useful are pruned out, and the ones that are useful are established and reinforced. So there's definitely a lot of brain development going on while we're sleeping. So very, very important. That said, you know, our little guy didn't sleep at all. So I don't know what he was doing, but nonetheless, you know, there's obviously very wide bands of normality depending on a child. So you can't say that every infant should be getting 14 hours of sleep. Sure, be nice for the mom and dad if they were, but you know, that's maybe not necessarily always going to happen. That said, I think there's a lot of work being done in the older kiddos as they're getting older, showing that exposure to blue light and light associated with electronics is keeping them up later, and just delaying that natural sleep that they should be getting throughout the night. So before they go to school, etc. And then that becomes even worse in adolescence, where, you know, your iPhone or your iPad or whatnot that you're using is keeping you up until 1 o'clock in the morning, and then you're getting up at 5 or 6 o'clock to go to school.
And that's not just our kids. That's everybody is impacted by using electronics before bed, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, there's good research out there that, you know, again, not all of these things are just direct. There can be very indirect effects. So lack of sleep is associated with higher obesity, which, as we've shown, is associated with poorer cognitive function, less working memory, etc. So not only is it just the day after you didn't get any sleep that you feel like you're in a fog, but long-term, chronic sleep deprivation will lead to exactly the same effects. You worsen cognitive performance, etc. And if that's occurring while you're a child and those brain systems are being developed, they're going to adapt to that, and that's going to become the norm, right? So they're not getting everything they need. They can't grow as much as they want. It'd be the exact same. You know, I tend to liken everything. We think about the brain as being this special thing. In a lot of ways, it's just like a muscle, right? We need to, you know, the same as going out for a run. If I want to go out for a run, I need the proper nutrition to get the maximum benefit, physical benefit from that run. Well, learning is like the run, and we have all these other elements, nutrition, sleep, etc., that we need to have in place in order to get the maximum benefit from that learning or that environment, etc., to build the best brain we can. You know, very, very analogous. So.
Yeah, it's easy. That's easy, Sean. We got it.
Seems to be, at least.
Well, so in our final minutes, I just want to give you an opportunity, and I really appreciate you jumping all around different topics, as those were the questions that we received from our followers that they really wanted to know. But is there anything that you want to leave us with in our last few minutes that you think, you know, is really a message that you guys in your lab and your work is really trying to spread?
Yeah, again, you know, I think, as I said, you know, kind of coming back to it, just love your child. That's going to get you a long way. And, you know, a multitude of sin can be covered by that single bit of advice. I mean, certainly what my wife and I sort of live up to, or try to, at least. I'm not sure if we're always successful, but particularly after a nightless sleep or a sleepless night. But then beyond that, if you're really interested, you know, there's a lot of really, really great groups, both here in Denver, throughout Colorado, and then across the U.S. That are trying to understand how all these things are you know, all these different aspects and influences are shaping brain development. And one of the issues that we really have is that, you know, if I put out a study that we're going to look at children with autism, we'll get calls almost immediately and be packed. We'll have tons of participants. It's getting the normal controls that are really, really tricky. The typical developing children. You know, I know that everyone's life is really busy, but, you know, if we can, you know, you take even that hour out of your day to stop by a lab and see what's going on. Even if you don't participate in the study, just come by. We like to talk. You know, we don't just sort of sit there and do this and you know, so we can hang out in our offices or whatever and just keep it to ourselves and just go to swanky conferences and illustrious places like Boca Raton or something. You know, we want to do this, and we want to make sure that it gets out there and has a positive impact. And, you know, so even if you just come by and have a chat, you know, you might want to, if you come by my lab, you might want to, you know, plan for 2 hours because I can keep talking and yapping, but, you know, swing on by. And if that encourages you to be involved in a study, all the better. But yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you for encouraging people to get involved, because, you know, I think many of us are eager for the information, but there's a process to getting it to that point where I can ask you and in 5 minutes, you can tell me kind of what the takeaways are. So yeah, we'll definitely make sure people have information for finding more about your lab and how they can get involved if they're local to Colorado.
Sure.
And just want to thank you so much for your time, John. This has been really interesting, and I think, you know, as complicated as we can make this be, and, you know, advertising this and getting to tell everybody what you're a neurophysicist and my first time talking to a neurophysicist, and at the end of the day, it can be as simple as we let it be, and to take care of ourselves and to take care of our kids. So thank you for all the work that you do and for sharing that with our natural mom community.
Perfect. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. This has been great. And the questions.
Anytime you want to yap, we'd love to have you.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, and certainly, feel free. Anyone who wants to send us an email, either asking us a question or saying I'm an idiot, that's perfectly fine too. You won't be the first, probably not the last. So yeah, it was brilliant. It was absolutely great to chat, and hopefully this leads to more bigger and better things.
That's great. Thank you, Sean. Take care.